Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival. We're really glad you're with us today. Thank you for coming and supporting the festival. A little housekeeping first. We want to let you know that the book festival is free, but what really supports us is the sale of our books. So we want you to go buy some books, buy them today, buy them tomorrow, keep buying them. We also have a donation table, or you can hand me donations, and for $20, we have the best beach bag ever. When you're out on the beach, not tomorrow, because you're going to be in Chilmark, but Monday through next week, you're going to be carrying this bag. We also would like to let you know that the bar restaurant, Henry's, is selling prepackaged food. I see some of you have purchased, including my husband, but it's all ready to go, so you just need to pick up the box and go. So please buy from them. Wanted to let you know that our panel coming up right now is Defending Women's Rights, and we have with us today Gillian Thomas, Alyssa Mastromonaco, Jessica Harris, and it's moderated by Allan Arffa. And a little bit about Allan: he's a partner at Paul Weiss Litigation and a co-chair of the firm's litigation department. In addition to his long and successful experience as a trial lawyer and general commercial litigator, Allan has worked in the pro bono area, where he is a prominent advocate for women's reproductive rights. He recently authored an amicus brief submitted to the Supreme Court in the Whole Women's Health case on behalf of over 100 women in the legal profession who came forward to tell their stories of their abortions. So with that, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to then introduce the panel. Let me start with Jessica Harris, who's to my left. One of the few sexist terms that seems to remain in the world is Renaissance men, but this is a true Renaissance woman. Jessica Harris has led an extraordinarily interesting life, which she recounts in her book, My Soul Looks Back. She grew up in New York, is a professor, has been a professor for decades at Queens. Has been a professor for decades at Queens College in English and teaching French. She's also been a prolific journalist and book reviewer, particular interest in writing about food. She's authored 12 cookbooks. She's written extensively on culture in Africa and the Americas. She's been on TV, radio, and she's a consultant to the Smithsonian. Her book focuses on New York in the 1970s and 80s, in which she spent a lot of time meeting fascinating people like Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, many others. And her book, in addition to being incredibly interesting, has 10 recipes, so it's also very practical. Next to her, Alyssa Mastromonaco also has an extraordinary career. She wrote the book Who Thought This Was a Good Idea? And she describes here, she was on the, try to do this quickly, these people have so many credentials, we're going to be here for a long time if I just give the introductions. She was on the Kerry campaign. She then worked for then Senator Obama. She worked on the first campaign. She started, after the election, she started as the administrative assistant to the president and director of scheduling and advance, and then moved over, she became the assistant to the president and became deputy chief of staff, where she served up until 2014. She's currently the president global communications strategy at A&E Networks, and she's a contributing editor of Mary Claire. Her book focuses really on her whole life, but principally her time working for the Obama administration. Finally, we have Gillian Thomas. Gillian, like me, is a lawyer. She's had a career working on employment discrimination matters, which she's really specialized in since leaving law school, where she worked first at a private firm called Vladeck Waldman, which is very familiar if you're a lawyer, as a plaintiff's firm in employment discrimination matters. She then, if I have the chronology right, went as a senior staff attorney at I guess it was then now Legal Defense and Education Fund, was then called Legal Momentum. She became a senior trial attorney at the EEOC's New York office. Today, she's a senior staff attorney at the ACLU's Women Rights Project, and she specializes in equal opportunities matters. Her book focuses on 10 incredibly interesting stories about women who are behind the most significant cases in the Title VII field. Title VII being part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that, among other things, prohibits discrimination because of sex, which is the name of her book. The book was named by the New York Times as one of the 10 books to read for Women's History Month, right? Do I get that right? Okay. All right, so it's an extraordinarily talented panel other than myself. So let's go to what I know the subject was defending women's rights, but I have to say what I actually found the most interesting thing about all the books was the willingness of people to share very personal stories and very personal aspects of their lives, which was something that struck me. I did this brief that was mentioned of women in the legal profession, which is not a profession where people are really sharing a lot of personal information unless they're being under oath and required to. So you're really not, it's not a lot of sharing, and yet these women were willing to come forward and tell stories of the abortions and how significant they were in helping them maintain their, or creating their employment careers. So to me, that was extraordinary. And then in each of these books, women are telling very personal stories, and Jessica tells her story, which is a very moving one and personal. But I guess my question is, how is it that you were comfortable, how'd you get yourself comfortable to share that and be willing to share such deeply personal things in your life and put it in a book that everyone reads?
Oh, well, first of all, I'm here for comic relief, so just understand. And the whole Renaissance woman thing, I'm not quite sure. Catherine de' Medici, maybe I'll poison everyone. I think the whole thing for me was, the actual working title of the book was A Moment in Time. And the idea was it was about time and place and people in that time and place. I honestly didn't realize I was revealing stuff until it was out and people started asking questions. I, as you heard, usually write cookbooks. And so the thing about writing cookbooks is it's 1 cup of this and 2 cups of that, and nobody really has to do very much. And so people all of a sudden were saying, well, how did you feel about your father? Excuse me? But you sort of write it, and then there it is, and you put yourself out to it. And it's interesting just being on a panel with my very esteemed colleagues here and trying to make the connections. I was a French major in school, and so I remember
Me too.
Oh, see, there's another connection. But do you remember, you probably are not old enough, when Marie Claire was notorious
No.
for being the very
Oh,
feminist
yeah.
magazine
Yes.
in France and in French, and actually had articles on, how to give yourself an abortion.
Yes.
And it was notorious. So that I'm of that period of time. I'm of that time and place. And so in the recounting of it, it was just one of those, well, the epigraph that didn't become the epigraph to the book because it would have cost too much money was a gentleman named Little Steveland Morris, better known as Stevie Wonder, who said, you better tell your story well, because if you lie, it will come to pass. So, something to think about. Anyhow, thank you.
Well, thank you. And Alyssa, you tell a lot of very personal stories.
Yeah. I let it rip.
Yeah. I didn't know what IBS was.
See, that's part of why I wrote about it.
But you were willing to put that out there.
I did. Well, when I started writing the book, when I left the White House, Hachette had approached me about writing a book, and I was like, why would anybody care what I have to say? Like, I really couldn't understand. And they're like, no, like, there are not a lot of people like you. And I said, oh, okay, that's fine. And so I knew immediately that the title would be Who Thought This Was a Good Idea, because those are the passive-aggressive emails that Barack Obama would send me when he was doing something he didn't like. And so he would know that it was I who thought it was a good idea, and I would have to write back, I thought it was a good idea. But I knew that that would be the title, but I wanted it to be, because the title was sort of funny, I wanted the book to be, and I'm kind of funny, I wanted it to be light. And it felt like a fraud when I was writing things that were kind of too glossy. And it made it seem like I was perfect, and I'm not perfect. And one of the things that I struggled with the most in the White House was that I had IBS. And we traveled to, I went to 65 countries, a lot of them with some really dodgy food. And so I couldn't keep it a secret. Like my buddy Dan Pfeiffer, there's a picture of us in Senegal, and it looks like we're having a romantic moment. And really, he's like, are you gonna be okay? Like, are you gonna make it? And those stories were just too great, and I thought that sharing that sort of side of me, well, one, you'd be surprised. One of the best invitations I got after the book came out was to keynote the IBS conference. And so I didn't do that. There was a conflict, otherwise I would have, because I'm happy to talk about like nearly shitting myself many times on Air Force One. But no, I wanted other people to know that you don't have to be perfect, you can be yourself, and that if you actually talk about these things, like something like IBS is triggered by anxiety. The more you don't talk about it and you try to hide it, the higher your anxiety is. And so that's why I thought that it was my job to sort of talk about the real people who work in the West Wing and what it's really like.
There was a particularly interesting story where you had an incident in the Vatican.
Yeah. So, and my roommates all know this about me, but like eggs can break either way on me. But when you travel with the president, you don't know when you're going to eat. It's not always certain when you're going to have your next meal. So we were in Rome, and that morning I was starving, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to have some scrambled eggs. And then we got in the car, and I'm with Susan Rice, and we both have our mantillas on, and she's like, girl, you look peaked. I'm like, no, it's fine, it's fine. And it was like the one time, it's probably one of the only times that two women have been the continuity of government. We were the two most senior people on the trip. And here I am, I'm like, Susan, we're the most senior people, and I'm afraid I'm going to have an accident. And she was like, you better keep it together. And so we got to the Vatican, and we're waiting to go in. President Obama's having his private, audience with the Pope. And literally, it was like a DEFCON 1 all-points bulletin to find me some POTUS strength Imodium, so that I didn't, and we couldn't find water, and so someone finally brings this little cup of water, and I'm like, we're at the Vatican, and someone found a small cup of water, like, where did that come from? And so I'll never know, but I was blessed because I did not poo on the Pope, which was the goal. So that is some people have very, exotic Vatican stories. Mine was like just not going to the bathroom. But he was very lovely. Pope Francis was very lovely.
And Gillian, you got all these other women to tell their stories, the women behind the 10 cases that you talk about. Was that easy? Were they willing to talk about it? They're heroes, so it's nice to tell the story, but they had very personal stories also that went along with it that were hard to get out.
Yeah, just to briefly summarize the book, Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act is the section of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination in employment. It was added very much at the last minute without, a congressional record or committee reports or any sort of guidance to the courts or to employers about what it was supposed to mean. And this was at a time when there were sex-segregated want ads, and flight attendants couldn't get married or they might get fired. Women had only just recently gotten the right to vote or gotten the right to hold certain jobs. Women had, there was a Supreme Court decision in the 1940s about women not being able to be bartenders unless their fathers or husbands owned the bar. So this was a time when what sex equality meant was really kind of up for grabs. And so I wanted to look at these seminal cases that the Supreme Court decided that really put meat on the bones of what discrimination because of sex meant. And so they fall into sort of three main categories. Pregnancy and motherhood, obviously a huge defining force and often an impediment to women's equality in the workplace. Sex stereotyping, the notion that there might be, as segregated ads suggested jobs that were for men or for women, and those stereotypes and prejudices, and how the court grappled with those, and then sexual harassment, for which there wasn't even a name, of course, in 1964, let alone an idea that it could be a federal offense to civil offense to sexually harass. So just with that background, I then sought out the women, after choosing which cases, I sought out the women and their attorneys who had brought the cases, and some of them were no longer living. Like the first chapter in the book, which was decided in 1971, Ida Phillips was no longer living. She had been denied a job because she had had a preschool-age daughter, and the employer thought that made her unreliable. But men with preschool-age children could get jobs. So I had to be creative, and so, for example, with Ida Phillips, I reached out and found 3 of her 7 children to speak to me, and also found her attorney, and who is still practicing in Florida. And so practically a 1 in that case, and throughout the 10 cases. The women were really actually pretty eager to speak with me, because with the exception maybe of Ann Hopkins, whose case, she's been featured in the Makers series on PBS, and aside from, she was denied partnership at Price Waterhouse because she needed to walk more femininely, talk more femininely, wear makeup, and get her hair styled. That was actual advice that was given to her when she was turned down for partner. But other than Ann Hopkins, none of these women were really known, and I felt my job in bringing them to light was to make them as famous as Anita Hill. Because what they did for me and for other working women was equally, if not more, lasting and important, because they created legal precedent. So most of them were pretty willing to speak with me, because I think they felt they were almost surprised that someone wanted to talk to them. Their cases, with the exception of Peggy Young, whose case was decided in 2015 and was the subject of a lot of media attention, for the most part, they lived in obscurity. So, I mean, the way I got them to speak to me was, I think, just letting them know how important their case had been to me as a lawyer, practicing lawyer, and using the case in my practice, and also my gratitude as a working woman who had benefited from that legacy. The only person who didn't speak to me was Michelle Vinson, who's the person who brought the case that ended up at the Supreme Court and defined sexual harassment as sex discrimination. And I don't have time here. I'm talking tomorrow, and hopefully I'll see some of you there. Her case was especially horrific, and it was there was a lot of sexual assault involved, not just what we think of typically as harassment. And I think it was just a chapter that she, no pun intended, wanted to put behind her. The one other thing I'll say is that, most of these women were working class, and I come from a very middle class background, but my, sort of educational pedigree and how I look and where I work now, I think definitely did require some, ingratiation or building of trust, especially because about half the women I interviewed, half of the plaintiffs were African American. And I think it was a real kind of, I had to make an approach that was very respectful and very also respectful of what they didn't want to say. And then they ended up telling me anyway. But I think letting people know that you don't have to tell me everything. This was understanding this was a very personal, very painful. Most of these women didn't end up with just about anything at the end except the legacy of the case. But in terms of money, ended up with very little. And so to kind of be cognizant of that and let them know that what they wanted to tell me was what I'd be happy with. And I ended up getting just about everything I could have hoped for.
You did, yes. You can see that in the stories. So I guess the other thing that struck me is each of the books was very much about a particular time and place in America. Jessica, I loved the beginning where you described yourself as the Zelig of the second half of the 20th century, which wasn't the first image that came to mind when I saw the book, but you said that you felt you was Zelig-like in the sense you had the privilege to spend part of your youth with Maya Angelou, Jane Baldwin, and the circle of friends as they were becoming icons of 20th century America. So can you tell people how did you get to meet these people? And how did you find them there?
It's a long story, but a short story. I taught and still teach at what is a higher education opportunity program at Queens College, which is part of the City University in New York. I teach in the SEEK program. And the person in 1970, never mind what, who was the director of faculty and curriculum at that program was a gentleman named Samuel Clemens Floyd III. Sort of very prescient in the literary allusion to Mark Twain. But he was also someone who had lived in the West Village. And he lived at 81 Horatio Street in the West Village. And it's a New York story. 81 Horatio Street was the building in which Baldwin also lived. And so from being Baldwin's neighbor, he became Baldwin's best friend. And so there was this incredible man teaching at Queens College alongside of me. And we gradually formed a relationship. And through that relationship, I got sort of taken literally kind of almost down the rabbit hole to meet all of these amazing people. So I got to meet Baldwin. I was also, at that point in time, the book review editor for what was the nascent Essence magazine. You may be familiar with Essence. I was the book review editor, and then by the end of the 70s, I was the travel editor. And so as book review editor, I was sort of notorious for going around with, the 2 empty shopping bags and visiting all of the publicists and exiting with full shopping bags. And in the course of that and writing articles about the people that I met, I also met Toni Morrison. And Maya Angelou was a part of that crowd, if you will. And so when I was 20, I was breathing very rarefied air.
Oh, must have been interesting. Now, Alyssa, you were at the White House at a time when I guess people would look back on it now as a golden age. I don't know if that's maybe just because of the current situation, but was it was it that way? In other words, was it for a woman who was very senior there? Did you feel comfortable? Did you feel at home? Did you feel you could do what you wanted to do?
I did, because I think the one thing also that I wanted to sort of show or demonstrate in my book was that none of us were pretending. Like, we were all very, like, the reason that so many of us, it's like I didn't write about this, but it's one of my favorite stories. Senator Obama had decided to run for president, and we were in Washington, and we were doing his announcement, and then we had to be in Chicago straight away, and I had a terrible flu, and so a friend of mine was driving me to Chicago to move, and he calls me, and he's like, "Where are you?" He's like, "You sound like you're in the car." I said, "I think we're outside of Toledo." He's like, "Why are you in Toledo?" And I'm like, "Because we're moving to Chicago. That's why I'm in Toledo." And it was like it kind of clicked with him in that moment that we were like uprooting our lives for him. And I think that he felt a very serious responsibility that we were making that sacrifice. And that's not common in politicians. Normally they sort of treat you like you should be lucky to be moving to Chicago. And he didn't. And that was the most important part of the entire thing, was that we were working for someone who didn't care if he lost, as long as he was always himself, and he did what he believed, whether it was controversial or unpopular. And so when we won, it felt so special, because we didn't lie about anything. We didn't sell anybody a bill of goods. And so when you walk into that building, and for the first time, my parents never took me in high school. They went in college with my sister, but I didn't get to go. And so the first time I ever went to the White House was the first time I had ever been at the White House. And I still get goosebumps, because I was with my deputy, Danielle, and she'd been with me forever, and she quit her job to move with me to Chicago. And we're hilarious, because I'm 5'2", and I'm very white, and she's very tall, and she's African American. We look hilarious together. And we're holding hands, and we shuffle into the West Wing. And President Bush was still there, and this is something Trumpish. And I almost feel like I can even say that President Bush, to an extent, was part of the golden era, because they were deeply committed to public service. And they knew that the transition of government was important, and the way that they treated us was so incredible. And they had binders, and the most generous thing, and this is like the beginning of my time, it's my first memory, and it's the thing that sort of colored my entire time in the White House, was that we went up to the EEOB, which is next to the White House, to try to go in, and they said, "No, ma'am, you're going to the West Wing today." And we said, "No, no, no, no. We're going to the EEOB." And they said, and they were super annoyed by us, and they're like, "No, like just go over to the other kiosk." And so we go and we walk down Pebble Beach, where you always see the reporters doing stand-ups, and it was like a scene from the television show, The West Wing. And we got there expecting a meeting, but really, Chief of Staff Bolton had set up a tour for Danielle and I because it was Christmas, and he said that when you get to the White House, you will never like Christmas again. It will be the worst. People are just going to come at you for invitations to parties, and there the two of us were, and we held hands the whole time, and they took us on this tour, and we were like, to me, that was just the kind of kindness that working in the White House, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, should be. And so that was just, and then, of course, like, we got sworn in, and it was amazing, and the West Wing's amazing. But to me, that's the moment that's like, that's what government is about, that's public service, that's what politics should be about. And so that's my and I think that that's gone, and I hope it comes back, but that's what I think is so sad. I mean, you can deal with Republicans and Democrats, and you always think no one's gonna do that much damage, but it is the lack of
civility.
Yes, they didn't care. All the things that we
reverence.
did, all of the binders and all, we did exactly what the Bush folks did for us, and they just didn't care. They threw them out, they put them in the burn bag, they didn't care. And so that's what makes me sad, and that's why I think even before that, everyone who occupied that building was so proud to be there. And so that's sort of like what I now consider the golden era of politics.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Well, Gillian, your book tells more of a tale about how I would say the American workplace has changed, really, from the time of Title VII to today. Mostly most of the cases, I guess, are 70s, 80s, but it goes up to today.
Yeah.
So maybe you could describe how you saw the workplace change through that process, because you really see that through the cases and the way the workplace is described in these different cases.
Well, I think, it's such a revolutionary transformation, not just for women, but for men. Anything that was changing about women's roles obviously implicated men's roles in the workplace too, and by extension, roles in culture. I mean, that's why it was that's why the kind of work we do in employment law, I think, is so interesting, because you're seeing societal evolution played out, in the workplace, and then changes that happen in the workplace, opportunities that open up in the workplace, then go out and change culture. It's really a fascinating window, and it's always evolving. But I mean, I think the most straightforward way to describe the changes in the book are that the early cases were about breaking down those sort of very black and white, if you will, or institutionalized sexism. So the very first case in the book, as I mentioned, is the one about, no mothers of young children, but fathers of young children are okay. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, that's a sex-based distinction. That's what this law was intended to get rid of. The next case in the book is about a woman who wanted to be a prison guard in Alabama, and there was a height and weight requirement for. And actually, you would have made it, believe it or not. It was.
Really? Because I don't make a lot of
The
roller
IBS would have
coasters.
stopped it.
Yeah, I know.
What are you?
5'2".
Oh, honey, it was 5'3", but it was close.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I know. It was 5'3" and 120 pounds, and she was 5'3" and 115. Now, I said to her, Kim Rawlinson, I said, why did you not just eat a couple pints of ice cream and go to 120? And she said, because it's arbitrary and it pissed me off. And, that was a good answer. Yeah. So, so that wasn't a facially discriminatory policy, but it was a policy that clearly had the effect of screening out just about all women and resulting in an all-male workforce. Then there was the California Department of Water and Power in the 1970s that had a rule that when employees had the deduction taken out of their paycheck every week to go to the company-funded or co-funded pension plan, that because women, according to actuarial tables, lived longer than men, they had more taken out for pension.
Yeah.
regardless of their own life expectancy or, what actuarial tables said about them and their particular risks. And the court struck that down. I only picked winning cases, by the way. I just wanted you to have a little Erin Brockovich moment at the end of every chapter, so we went with wins. So that was struck down. So, and then we start getting into more kind of, I don't want to say necessarily subtle, but more nuanced or complex. For example, a case decided in 1991, the year after I graduated from college, was a case brought by women and men in the United Auto Workers Union against a fetal protection policy that the company put in place, which basically barred anyone from, it was a battery making company, and barred anyone from working in a job that involved contact with lead, which of course were the highest paying jobs in all the factories that Johnson Controls operated, unless you could prove you were infertile. So it wasn't even representing to the company, I'm done with my childbearing, or I don't want to have kids, or guess what, I don't have sex with men, so I'm really not at high risk of getting pregnant, or I'm using contraception, or, none of those representations were enough unless you had a doctor's note saying you were infertile, you were going and working as a custodian and making far less money. And so women got their tubes tied. Women got sterilized because those paychecks were so important. And so in 1991, the Supreme Court was saying, when it comes to pregnancy, where it used to be that pregnancy was something that held women back, you can't hold this job because it's too dangerous for you. You can't hold this job because you might have to lift something and your frail constitution won't allow you to do it. Mm-hmm. This was also of a piece with that, saying we're not going to let you take risks even if you are informed about them and want to take risks. And the court said no. This is the choice for a woman to make about whether her paycheck is more important to her than being a mother. Treating women as potentially pregnant is not going to fly. The sort of flip side of that now, just to finish up on pregnancy discrimination, and it's an issue that is very much a part of my practice today in 2017. I argued a case just this week in just one of these cases, is the issue of accommodation of pregnancy's symptoms. So the flip side of the Johnson Controls case is, okay, we're going to now have women, we're going to get rid of the height and weight requirements that keep women out of these physical, dangerous jobs. We're going to say they're allowed to take risks and work in these dangerous jobs, but the reality is that some of the jobs are dangerous, and pregnancy is a major medical event, and so it may be necessary that a woman working as a firefighter or a police officer, or conversely in a lower wage job like a nursing assistant or a housekeeper in a hotel, is maybe going to need some relief from certain job obligations for the duration of her pregnancy. And what's the employer's obligation in terms of accommodating those restrictions? And employers are incredibly punitive. Even after Young versus UPS was decided 2 years ago, supposedly settling this, it's a very punitive response of, you entered this job, you knew what it took, and so if you can't cut it while you're pregnant, get out. So that whole issue of pregnancy and also motherhood relatedly remain huge issues. Just very quickly to wrap up, I think another huge trend, we talked about this last night, is sexual harassment, which, at this point I think the law has evolved as far as it's going to go on sexual harassment. I don't think there's really anywhere else for it to define what is harassing behavior. Maybe something with respect to online harassment and the collision with First Amendment issues, that maybe needs to be worked out, but we know what's illegal. And it's, at this point, a cultural issue that I think remains entrenched and is a nut that's yet to be cracked culturally. And then finally is the issue that I think is the next Title VII issue that the Supreme Court will deal with, which is sexual orientation as sex discrimination and gender identity discrimination as sex discrimination. There's been a lot of discussion about, is sexual orientation discrimination because of sex? And my answer is most assuredly yes, but it remains to be seen what the courts say.
I'm told we're supposed to go to the question and answer, but just one more I had. I couldn't help, as a lawyer reading it, just the questioning from the courts, from the early cases to the more recent one.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. You forget how people thought and spoke, even judges. I mean, can you describe some of the questioning in these early
I'll-
cases? Was
Yeah,
pretty
very,
remarkable.
very quickly, because, and if anyone really wants to nerd out hard, you can listen to the oral arguments going back to, I don't know how far they go back, but the first case in my book, which was argued in 1970, you can listen to. And, this was the first Title VII case, not just the first sex discrimination case, but first Title VII case that had come in before the court, and the justices just did not understand what it was supposed to do. I mean, they were completely bollocksed up. And so, for instance, you have Harry Blackmun, who 3 years later became a feminist icon with the Roe v. Wade decision, asking the question of Bill Robinson, who was arguing for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So let me try to get this straight, this Title VII business. Let me try to understand. So if a hospital has always hired female nurses, and they like how women do the job, and they're very happy with that, and then a man comes in and wants to be hired as a nurse, do they have to hire him as a nurse? And, Bill Robinson says, yes, Justice Blackmun, that's what sex discrimination means. And then you have poor Hugo Black saying, now, wait a minute, what about ditch digging? If you have a guy who's hiring ditch diggers, and he likes to hire men, and he's confident men can do it, and then a woman comes in and wants to dig a ditch, does he have to hire her? And Bill Robinson says, if she's able to do the job, yes, that is what... non-discrimination because of sex means. But then the pièce de résistance is when Chief Justice Warren Burger pipes up and says, no, this law doesn't apply to federal judges, right? And Bill Robinson said, no, it does not, Mr. Chief Justice. I didn't think so. I didn't think it did. And then, but he later just...
They amended it later. So
What'd you say?
they amended the law later.
Yes, correct. In 1972, it was amended to apply to state and federal employers. So, to psych. But then the final thing that was also so fascinating. I mean, this is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The job that Ida Phillips was turned down for on the assembly line involved a lot of intricate work with her fingers. It was working on little electrical pieces on an assembly line, and part of the argument from the company about why this couldn't be sex discrimination to exclude her was because 70% of their workforce was already women. It was just women with older children or no children. And so they said, how can it be sex discrimination if we hire so many women? So after Berger asked what the job entailed, and the lawyer for Martin Marietta explained that it was this intricate work, digital work, Berger said, oh, well, of course women do that well. That's why they're such good typists.
Damn.
Different time.
Not embarrassed. Not taking it back.
All right, I'm told we have about 10 minutes left. Are there any questions? If there are, there's someone coming around with a microphone. Anyone want to ask? I see a question.
Hello? Oh, okay, hi, thanks. So this kind of goes great with the last panel. I'm a chemical engineer working in the defense industry, and I don't see a lot of women in the defense industry, and I'll tell you there's still a lot of sexism that I encounter every day. And now I'm forgetting my question, but I do want to say that we do have a group in Connecticut. It is one of these indivisible grassroots groups. In New Haven alone, we have 2,700 people. And we have a huge group of scientists, and we did get a group to do a science march in New Haven, and we had like 3,000 people.
That's great.
So now we've been really encouraging scientists to run for office and really trying to get women to run, to change, especially at the local level. And we've had an amazing impact, and it's really nice to see. So I think that this is the change that you need, because you need this cultural change. I mean, when I first started in engineering, I thought that there would be more women, like 20 years later, and there's not. There really is just not. I would say there's less. So how do you encourage people, like from the top down, also to take these professional jobs as women that are so hard, and you're going to have a strong backbone because you just get shit on by men all the time. Like every day, and let alone I never see people of color or so, in most of my jobs.
Alan, what do you tell
me?
your clients?
Well, that's true. We have to give advice like that to clients all the time, but I don't know, they're fairly enlightened, I would say. A lot of employers that we deal with are fairly understand that, but I think you're right. It may depend on different sectors being different, and unfortunately, particularly what you're describing, you would think would be, like Silicon Valley, you would think would be very open to this, but apparently there are a lot of issues as well there. But I don't know what the answers are. I
But-
don't know if you guys have ideas.
Well, I would just say that one of the things that I think, because I get asked this all the time, what do we do to have an impact? And I think that something I've learned through working very closely with the Women's March, which is still an ongoing organization, is that it's sort of like power in numbers. And even if there aren't people in your job sitting next to you that are women, it's getting together with your indivisible group and marching and getting to know one another and being a support system. And so for us, even in the White House, everybody talks, there weren't a ton of women in the West Wing, but once a quarter, once every couple of months, all of us, all of the female cabinet secretaries and senior women would go out for dinner. And what we would talk about would range the gambit. I mean, including they wanted to get me a boyfriend. They're like, Alyssa, you don't date. We have to help you. And so we helped each other in 100 different ways. But that was really, we just knew we weren't alone. So if you were sitting in a room and you were with 10 dudes, you might have been alone in that room, but you weren't alone in life. And so that's kind of how I look at it.
I would, and there was that New York Times piece about the women amplifying other
Yeah.
women in meetings, and I think as a concurrent strategy, it's also finding male allies, because they are there, and I do get frustrated when I speak to firms or speak to women's organizations, and I'm frankly kind of sick of, although the camaraderie and the looking out for one another that you're talking about is essential. I'm sick of women talking to other women about these problems, because they really do, it's usually men in charge, it's usually men doing the harassing, and we need male leaders who set zero tolerance policies and then stick to them. We need men who are, more middle managers, speaking up in rooms full of only men when talk gets unacceptable, and championing other women. I mean, I think both Alyssa and Jessica's stories were so striking because of the men in their lives nurturing them and pushing them forward. And I certainly have some of my own stories like that, and also a lot of the women in the book actually had male lawyers pushing these cases forward, even as they were getting enlightened, like, oh yeah, this is sex discrimination. So I just wanted to add on that. I think it's two sides of the same coin of women coming forward with their stories, not backing down, holding each other up when there are complaints, but then also it's incumbent on men who hold the majority of positions of power to make it a priority.
In the White House, we actually had the group of men too, and we called them the Brodeo, which sounds terrible. It sounds kind of pejorative, but no, they were like my dudes. They always had my back, and they were the Brodeo. We had Brodeo dinner once a quarter too.
Okay, I know in the world of food in New York, we had at one point something we called the estrogen table. And it was just women getting together, and the idea was it was infrequent. It was whenever it was called, everybody would go. It wasn't sort of sequential or periodic in that sense. And it was just about sharing what that meant, because certainly the wonderful world of food is
Really tough.
another one of those realms in which things don't work at all,
In the least.
in the least.
Hi, at least in part with the help of the new documentary film, Equal Means Equal, the state of Nevada just became the first state in 40 years to ratify the ERA, and the 36th state out of 38 needed, regardless of the deadline. But I was wondering if you could say what you feel about the status of the ERA and the new movement to reopen the movement to ratify it, and all of you, but I know that you're connected with that.
Sure. Actually, my boss is featured in that movie, Lenora Lapidus. She's the director of the Women's Rights Project. I mean, I think the new movement to ratify the ERA is incredibly valuable to the extent that it is keeping a conversation going that's been going for years and years. In terms of, and I'm sure a lot of people disagree with me, and this is not an official ACLU position. This is my position as a pragmatist and a pessimist when it comes to political movements, that there is only so much bandwidth that people have for activism, that politicians have for paying attention to these issues as opposed to the myriad other issues that are on their plate. And so much of what the ERA was intended to remedy has been, I don't want to say fixed, because obviously everything is still broken, but in sort of systemic ways. But in terms of legal protections, I think much of the ERA's raison d'etre has been sort of has been achieved, even though the ERA itself has not been. So if it could be ratified, with not too much difficulty, I would be right there rallying for it. I am so pessimistic about, first of all, anything happening in Washington. I think we just have to, just pretend as if it's not, Congress is not there for us. That's my personal feeling, and focus our efforts on state and local government. Stopping rollbacks that are happening in Washington, but in terms of trying to advance anything affirmative or progressive, I fear there's not much happening. There are few isolated areas where we might make some progress, such as family leave, which the Republicans are actually talking about for the first time. But so that's sort of a rambling answer. I just am so daunted by how much it takes to move the needle in any area that has to do with gender, that I think we have to be very selective about where we put our energies.
Anyone else? What was that? Oh, someone over here.
I can't help but ask the question. When you say that, Gillian, about we have to be so selective, why is it so hard? It's 51% of the population. Why is it so hard to move the needle? Or I'm asking it to all of you, but
Yeah.
But that's it. There should be more progress when
Yes.
when we can elect anyone but a woman, which clearly we have. And what's wrong?
Yeah, yeah. Isn't it stunning? I know. The 53% of white women who voted for him, I will never
The figure
understand.
I can't figure out.
Well, I think actually to turn it back to at the brief that Allan wrote in Whole Women's, or helped bring women together for Whole Women's Health, involving women telling their stories of abortion. I think that's actually so many. And everybody else, please chime in. I don't have lots of wisdom about this, but I think so many women are silent about how policy decisions affect them. And the statistic is something like 40% of American women will have had an abortion by the time they're 40, or maybe it's a third of them by the time they're 40. Those are millions and millions and millions and millions of women who should be standing up and talking about access to abortion care, and because of the shame and stigma around it, they don't. And if those voices were raised up, I think you'd see a lot more, and the stigma were removed through numbers. I think you'd see more women coming forward. I think it's the same issue with sexual harassment. Once women take their talk out of the circle of women and out into, activism in their workplaces, that will help change. But I think my last thing is, I think it's money in politics. Business interests are very, very powerful and convince policymakers that it's bad for business to do things like provide childcare, provide parental leave. All the statistics don't show that, but I think it's a powerful message, and so that's a huge resistance point.
Well, I think just quickly, this was in the news last week. I guess there's also sort of a complacency, right? Like
Yes.
growing up, I can't imagine a time, that abortion wouldn't be legal. Well, last week, the DCCC, the Democratic Campaign Committee, announced that they would support candidates and they
Yeah.
didn't have to be pro-choice. And I tried to be sort of mellow on Twitter because I don't want people to yell at me. I went nuts. And, Ben Ray Lujan is there saying, you know what, we're not going to have it's not going to be a litmus test. And now I don't necessarily think the party should have a litmus test, but then don't have them, period. Don't just call out, reproductive rights as something that's like, you can be for or against, it's okay, we'll still give you money. And so that to me was like, wow, the
Yeah.
Democratic Party, that was my, I emailed Elise Hogue at NARAL and I was like, put me on the board. Like, I didn't think that we would need this, but like, I'll do anything.
Yeah, it feels like a total betrayal.
Yeah.
Agreed.
We want to thank our panel and thank you for all this great conversation. And you can follow our authors to the Menemsha Room, buy their book, buy one of the tote bags to take it home with. And,
Yeah, it's
right.
awesome.
She's our #1 seller today. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
was shocked. You're like, whoa.